The day King Robert Baratheon returned from his final hunt, the smell of blood on his breath and a mortal wound in his side, the realm of Westeros hovered on the edge of a knife. The death of a king, especially one as famously impulsive, boisterous, and enthralling as Robert, was bound to shake the Seven Kingdoms to their core. Rumors flew through the halls of the Red Keep like startled birds. Some whispered that the boar had been unnaturally large and cunning, that foul play was involved. Others insisted that King Robert's injuries were simply the result of excessive wine and carelessness. But beneath all those immediate concerns, a deeper tension brewed, one that would determine the fate of the realm for years to come. That tension centered around Robert's eldest son, Joffrey Baratheon. Yet fate can twist in unexpected ways, and sometimes the things everyone believes to be inevitable never actually come to pass. In this turning of the wheel, Joffrey Baratheon was never crowned king, and the consequences of that single alteration rippled through every kingdom, from the scorching deserts of Dorne to the ice-chilled winds beyond the wall. When the bells began their mournful toll to announce the imminent death of King Robert, the nobles and servants alike crowded the halls and chambers of the Red Keep with anxious hearts. Queen Cersei Lannister, lioness of the Rock and fierce defender of her children's claim, moved through the corridors with an almost eerie calm. Behind her elegant demeanor lay a woman steeling herself for the greatest confrontation of her life. For she knew the secret, that Joffrey was not Robert's child but Jaime's, and she also knew Lord Eddard Stark, the newly appointed Hand of the King, had begun to piece together that very same secret. In another turning of events, she might have miscalculated, as she often did, and set in motion the steps that would lead to Joffrey's crowning. But this time, there were slight, almost imperceptible differences in timing and opportunity, differences that would open a different road and result in an altered fate. On his deathbed, King Robert, raving from pain and fortified by the poppy milk his maester had administered, feebly clutched at Eddard Stark's hand and forced a final confession. He apologized for the many sins of his kingship, his infidelity, his neglect of the realm. Ned, jaw set, listened with compassion and sorrow, for though the king had changed much since the days of their youth, Robert was still, somewhere beneath the layers of wine-bloated flesh and war-weary eyes, the friend he had once known. Then Robert, with quivering breath, pressed upon him the burden of the regency. Only, this time, Ned stayed longer at Robert's bedside than before. The conversation meandered from the future of the realm to the old days in the Vale. Robert said he regretted not listening to Jon Arryn more carefully. Jon, he suspected something, Robert admitted with eyes brimming with tears and memory. He came to me, he tried to tell me. Ned went rigid. The king's trembling voice dropped lower. It's not right. My children, my children. That was when Robert slipped into a fevered haze. Ned stayed with him well beyond reason, anxious for one more moment of lucidity. Maester Pycelle stood by and watched. Varys, the master of whisperers, lingered in the shadows, his half-smile as inscrutable as ever. Lord Peter Baelish approached and withdrew, eyes flickering with calculations that seemed never-ending in complexity. But Ned, duty-bound Ned, remained because honor demanded it. Finally, as Robert's last breath rattled in his chest, Ned pressed the king's signet ring onto his own finger, determined to handle the succession justly. He had not yet openly confronted Cersei about the truth, but the moment for it was fast approaching. In other circumstances, perhaps Cersei might have outmaneuvered him, forcing Joffrey's coronation swiftly. But a critical chain of events diverged, each small link forging a new future. Lord Renly Baratheon, informed through a timely whisper from Varys, rushed to the Tower of the Hand and cornered Ned before Ned had a chance to confront the Queen. Renly, younger brother to Robert, offered Ned a swift and decisive plan. Arrest Cersei and her children that very night. He had men ready, he said, loyal to House Baratheon, prepared to ensure the throne did not pass to an illegitimate boy. In the original course of events, Ned's refusal to go behind the law and the rightful process gave Cersei the advantage. But this time Ned hesitated less. He still disliked the notion of underhandedness, but Robert's final, half-coherent confession still echoed in his mind. The king had asked Ned to protect the realm, to do what was best for the Seven Kingdoms, and he had more strongly implied that Joffrey was not his blood. In that moment, Ned found a sliver of steel within him that overcame his usual sense of procedure. If Joffrey was indeed Jaime Lannister's son, then placing him on the throne would be a betrayal of Robert and all they had fought for. Ned, with new conviction, agreed to Renly's plan. Night fell upon the Red Keep, and the conspirators made their moves. Ned Stark, though not a cunning man in the ways of court intrigue, was an experienced battlefield commander. He sent word to his own men, instructing them to stand guard on all passages leading to the royal apartments. Renly, who had maintained a close relationship with the small council and certain gold cloaks, arranged for the city watch to receive discreet instructions. Peter Baelish, initially prepared to offer Ned a deal that would have allowed Joffrey's coronation in exchange for the wardship of Sansa and Ned's promise of alliance, found himself outmaneuvered. He realized Ned was moving more decisively than he had anticipated. Baelish, always flexible, elected to watch how events unfolded before choosing a side, but he secretly placed a few key men of his own around the keep to gather intelligence. Near the hour of the wolf, when moonlight cast pale shadows through the windows, they struck. Ned personally led a contingent of his best guards to the royal apartments. The Lannister guards posted there, though formidable, were too few to resist a determined show of force from Stark and Baratheon men combined. Jaime Lannister was not within the Red Keep that night, having ridden out earlier for unknown business, a stroke of luck for Ned. Cersei, awakened by the clamor, emerged in her nightgown to find swords pointed at her, along with Renly standing behind them, his face pale but resolute. The queen tried to demand an explanation, but Ned, with sorrow in his eyes, informed her she was under arrest. She spat vile curses, insisted she was the queen regent, that Joffrey was the rightful heir. But it was no use. The gold cloaks, commanded by a captain who had accepted the hush bribes of Renly and was aware of the new plan, did not come to her aid. Not quickly enough, at least. Sansa Stark, asleep in her bedchamber, knew nothing of these dire events until Lannister guards, panicking, tried to gather the royal children to whisk them away. Arya, by strange coincidence, had been out practicing her water dancing with Syrio Farrell and ended up in a far corridor. The confusion in the corridors was enough for her to slip away unnoticed. Meanwhile, Tommen and Myrcella, young, innocent in many ways, had been gathered by a frightened maid. Joffrey himself, ever high-strung, stormed into the hallway demanding answers. When he saw Ned Stark and Renly confronting his mother, he began shouting that he was the king. Ned, voice heavy, commanded him to stand down. Renly, seizing the moment, had the gold cloaks place Joffrey under custody. A knot in Ned's stomach told him that this would change everything, but he also felt sure that truth demanded it. In the confusion of that night, Peter Baelish observed from the shadows, brow furrowed. He realized Ned Stark had indeed acted. The usual script, where Cersei outplayed Ned through deception and rapid action, had been undone by a single evening's earlier conversation and a stronger impetus from Robert's final words. Littlefinger considered intervening, but the tide had already turned. Instead, he quietly slipped away to gather more intelligence, deciding it was best to preserve himself for whatever new shape the realm would take. By dawn, the Red Keep's atmosphere had changed radically. The entire Lannister household was in an uproar. Some Lannister servants cowered in corners. A few gold cloaks loyal to the Lannisters tried to free Cersei, but were swiftly overcome by the combined might of Stark and Baratheon guards. Grand Maester Pycelle, trembling and outraged, tried to object to the arrest of the Queen Regent. He found himself forcibly escorted to his chambers, where he was placed under watch. Varys, for his part, offered no direct opposition. He bowed deeply to Ned Stark, murmuring that he served the realm and was relieved that wise men were at the helm. Ned was not sure how sincere that was, but accepted it for the moment. Soon, the clamor reached every ear in King's Landing. Merchants whispered that the Queen had been arrested for treason, that the King's children were to be proven bastards. The common folk, for the most part, were baffled and uncertain. But the seeds of rumor took root, and soon it was widely gossiped that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were not the king's trueborn offspring. With Cersei and Joffrey under guard, Ned called the small council together in the great hall that morning, standing beneath the Iron Throne. Renly Baratheon sat to one side, and to the amazement of many, Stannis Baratheon arrived in King's Landing the next day, having been informed of Robert's dire condition through his own network of ravens. In the original timeline, Stannis' departure to Dragonstone and Ned's inability to coordinate with him had led to a fractured claim. But now, as soon as Stannis entered the city, he was met by Renly, who swallowed his pride and recognized that Stannis was the elder brother, King Robert's rightful heir if indeed Joffrey was proven illegitimate. Stannis, stern-faced, wasted no time in demanding an audience with Ned Stark. In the meeting that followed, Ned produced the proof that Jon Arryn had begun to compile, a line of genealogies and notes that indicated the Baratheon line always bore dark-haired children, and yet Cersei's supposed Baratheon children were all golden-haired. Robert's final delirious words, though not a clear confession, offered a strong hint that he had realized the truth in his last moments. Varys, speaking in that soft, unctuous tone, stated that many rumors had circulated about Cersei and Jaime. Baelish, deciding to hedge his bets, confirmed that there were indeed such rumors, though he craftily refrained from admitting that he knew more. Stannis, ever rigid in his sense of right and wrong, let no hint of doubt show in his hawkish eyes. "The Iron Throne is mine," he proclaimed. "If indeed Joffrey is no son of my brother." Ned, who never much liked or disliked Stannis, saw in him a man of principle, though grim and unyielding. Renly said nothing at that moment, stifling whatever ambitions he had because he knew that under these circumstances, he might not have the realm's support. "Then we shall have a trial," Ned suggested, though he knew the truth would condemn Joffrey. Renly, seizing the opportunity for unity, agreed. Stannis acquiesced, for he believed in law and order as fervently as he believed in his own right. Meanwhile, Joffrey and Cersei roiled in their improvised cells, raging at the indignity. Cersei threatened that Tywin Lannister would raze King's Landing to the ground if they continued this madness. Joffrey demanded to be set free, shouting that he was the king. Father be damned. But there was no king crowned that day. By evening, the crows on the city walls cawed over a tension-choked capital. The gold cloaks were split in loyalty, some remembering the Lannisters' gold, others swayed by the presence of two Baratheons, Stannis and Renly, both laying claim to the Iron Throne. Tyrion Lannister, who had been traveling in the Riverlands, heard the news with shock, uncertain how to respond. Tywin Lannister, encamped near Harrenhal with the might of the Westerlands, also received tidings that his daughter and grandchildren were imprisoned. In another course of events, he might have marched at once, but the political situation was far less certain. The realm, for now, was not wholeheartedly rallying behind one single figure. Stannis had the legal claim, Renly had the charm and the city, and Ned Stark was orchestrating a process that many lords might see as just. Lord Tywin did not want to fling himself into war without calculating the odds. As the days passed and King Robert's funeral was somberly arranged, Ned Stark found himself once again in a precarious position. He needed to ensure the realm would accept the next king without plunging into chaos. Stannis was the rightful heir, but would the lords of the realm rally to him if they feared a war with House Lannister? Would Renly stand aside once the crown was settled, or would his supporters push him to claim the throne instead, citing the realm's preference for a more likable king? And what of the North, still loyal to Ned, but uncertain how strongly they felt about Stannis? In that vacuum, the trial of Joffrey and Cersei progressed. A panel of High Lords was convened. Stannis insisted upon a proper inquest. Ned presided over it as Hand of the King, though in truth, the realm did not strictly have a king at that moment. The panel included men who could be deemed neutral, lords who had not allied strongly with either the Baratheons or the Lannisters, and a few who had no known quarrel with Ned Stark. Lords from the Crownlands, Stormlands, and Riverlands were called. Even Tyrion Lannister, having arrived in haste, demanded to observe the proceedings. He argued for his sister's defense, though not with the same vigor he might have shown had he believed her innocent. During the trial, evidence was presented. The line of black-haired Baratheons going back centuries, statements from maids who had served Cersei intimately and had observed her closeness with Jaime, the overwhelming differences in appearance between Robert and Joffrey. Joffrey, defiant to the last, demanded they cease their nonsense. Cersei refused to speak, her silence a molten brand of hatred. Tyrion, in a surprisingly cool manner, asked if there was definitive physical proof. Jaime was not available to confirm or deny, having vanished from King's Landing as soon as word of the arrest spread. Rumors placed him on the road to Casterly Rock, or perhaps on some covert mission to free his family. The conclusion became inevitable. The evidence, however circumstantial, was staggering, and Robert's final words, albeit overheard by only a handful of men, weighed heavily on the minds of the lords. There was a sense that the king had indeed suspected something foul in his final hours. Eventually, the panel ruled that Joffrey Baratheon was not the trueborn son of Robert Baratheon, but was instead the bastard son of Cersei and Jaime Lannister. This made him ineligible for the crown, a conclusion that would have reverberated like thunder throughout the realm. Tommen and Myrcella were likewise deemed illegitimate. Stannis stepped forward. "Then I am king," he said. "As Robert's heir, the throne is mine by rights. Let all those who deny it stand aside." His pronouncement was as cold as steel. Renly, biting his lip, acknowledged that in the eyes of the law, his older brother was indeed the rightful king. Yet many of the lords in attendance shifted nervously, for Stannis was not known to be a man who inspired love. He was respected for his rigid sense of justice and his steadfastness, but he lacked the easy charm that had endeared Robert to the realm. That was the moment Ned Stark had to decide whether to support Stannis wholeheartedly or to attempt a compromise that might preserve peace. He could see that Renly's supporters might cause trouble, that House Lannister would not accept the imprisonment of Cersei and her children easily, and that Tywin Lannister was sure to respond with force if pushed. Ned, guided by an earnest desire to protect the realm, tried to reason with Stannis. "We need unity," he said. "Your brother Renly has many friends here. Let us not tear ourselves apart." Stannis, though, was not a man for half measures. "The Iron Throne is mine, and I shall accept no conditions upon that. If Renly bows, all will be well. If House Lannister means to defy me, then they shall be met with the fury of the rightful king." Word of the verdict spread like wildfire through King's Landing and beyond. People gossiped in the streets, sometimes mocking the Lannisters, sometimes fearing retribution. The tension thickened daily. Renly's presence in the city provided a slight measure of calm, for he was good at winning hearts. But it was not enough to quell the general anxiety that a war might soon erupt. And war indeed loomed, for Tywin Lannister was already mustering a great host and demanding the release of his daughter and grandchildren. In the cells of Maegor's Holdfast, Joffrey raged at the injustice, swearing that he would someday take the heads of every traitor in the city. Cersei, for her part, knew that her father's wrath would be swift. She only hoped he could muster enough force to pressure the new power structure into letting them go. She attempted to cajole the guards, to bribe them, to use her wiles. But these men answered to Ned Stark and Renly Baratheon now, and they knew the eyes of the realm were upon them. One misstep could see them hanged for treason, so her efforts came to naught. Tommen and Myrcella, kept in more comfortable quarters but still under watch, wept in confusion. Tyrion tried to secure their release, but no one in power was willing to let the children go just yet, fearing it would give the Lannisters a bargaining chip to start a war. The day of Robert Baratheon's funeral came like a gathering storm. His body, encased in precious oils and sealed within a golden coffin, was put on display in the Great September of Baelor. The crowd that gathered to witness was larger than any in recent memory. They whispered among themselves, glancing at the vacant space where the queen would have stood, at the overshadowed dais meant for the new king, which was currently draped in the Baratheon stag banner. The High Septon read the final rites, his voice echoing through the sept's lofty columns. Ned Stark stood with Stannis and Renly on either side. Each brother displayed a face carved from stone. Stannis seemed lost in his own calculations, his own determination to ensure the realm recognized his right. Renly showed an uncharacteristic somberness. He had loved his brother Robert, even if only for the memories of better times. Ned Stark listened to the prayers, feeling the weight of responsibility bear down upon him harder than ever. In arresting Cersei and Joffrey, he had avoided an immediate disaster, Joffrey sitting the throne, but he also knew he might have ignited a far larger conflict. After the final prayer, the congregation filed out. In the old tradition, Robert's coffin would be borne on a grand funeral barge down the Blackwater Rush, to be interred in the crypts of the Red Keep's old tomb. As the barge set off, thousands lined the banks of the river to pay their respects or simply to witness the spectacle. Ned, from the vantage of the great September steps, watched the flicker of torches as the barge faded into the distance. The realm had lost its king, and even if Robert had not been the best king, he was at least an anointed Baratheon monarch recognized by all. Now, with the question of succession complicated by the revelation of Joffrey's illegitimacy, Ned feared the realm might unravel. For a week or more, the city was caught in suspended tension. Stannis' presence, overshadowed by his intense personality, created a sense that events were about to escalate. Renly tried to counsel him, urging him to negotiate with Tywin Lannister for the release of Cersei and the children on terms that might avoid open war. Stannis was reluctant, for he believed that justice must be done. Cersei and her brood deserve punishment, he told Ned. Their treachery and deception almost placed a bastard upon the throne. Ned, though not entirely unsympathetic, pointed out the obvious danger. If Tywin Lannister feels cornered, he will fight. He has the West behind him, and we cannot ignore the other great houses. War is the last thing Robert would have wanted. Thus the negotiations began, with Ned Stark as hand of the king and regent for the time being, though in truth it was Stannis who claimed that role as rightful king, and Ned was but a caretaker in this transitional period. Letters were sent to Tywin, offering leniency for Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen if the Lannisters recognized Stannis' claim and swore fealty. The terms included a relinquishment of high offices held by Lannisters, and demands for reparations to the crown for the years of deceit. They also called for Jaime Lannister to be turned over to face judgment for his role, if any, in fathering the bastard children. The letter was bold, perhaps too bold. Tywin Lannister was not a man who bowed easily. He responded curtly that House Lannister did not acknowledge the so-called illegitimacy of his grandchildren, that the trial had been biased, and that if Cersei and her children were not released immediately, he would march on the capital. The lines of war were drawn. Noble houses across Westeros began weighing their allegiances. In the north, Robb Stark, still a youth in Winterfell, received word from his father about the crisis. He began mustering forces to march south if needed, though Ned counseled caution. In the Vale, Lisa Arryn vacillated, wanting to stay neutral, but the memory of Jon Arryn's death and the rumor that the Lannisters might have had a hand in it left her reluctant to side with them. In the Reach, Margaery Tyrell and her powerful family took stock of the situation. Stannis or Renly could both be potential allies for a future match. The Tyrells had reason to resent the Lannisters for overshadowing them at court. They seemed more inclined to wait and see which brother, Stannis or Renly, claimed the throne. In the Riverlands, House Tully was caught between old ties to Ned Stark and the knowledge that open war would threaten their borders if Tywin marched. Some lords quietly hoped for a compromise that would see Renly crowned instead of Stannis, as Renly was more amenable. Amidst all of these shifting alliances, Ned Stark tried desperately to keep the peace. He wrote personal letters to the great houses, explaining the gravity of the revelations regarding Joffrey's parentage, stressing the need for unity under the rightful Baratheon heir. He also tried to moderate Stannis' harsh stance, urging him to offer Tywin Lannister something that might assuage his wounded pride. But Stannis refused to yield. Renly grew restless, believing that, with a lighter touch, he could have ended this standoff swiftly. In the small council, Varys poured honeyed words into Ned's ear, advocating for a clever, diplomatic approach, perhaps releasing Tommen and Myrcella as a sign of good faith while retaining Joffrey as a hostage. Baelish, too, had his own suggestions. He proposed that a betrothal might mend the rift. Perhaps Myrcella could be married to a High Lord's son, forging a bond that would secure her release. Stannis bristled at the idea, but Ned considered it. Ultimately, they tried a partial measure. They released Myrcella into the care of the faith, to be fostered with the High Septon, as a demonstration of goodwill. Cersei remained imprisoned in comfortable quarters, and Tommen and Joffrey were still considered too dangerous to free. This gesture did little to soften Tywin, who saw it as an empty concession. His reply was unequivocal. "My daughter and her children shall be returned to me, or I shall come for them myself." The days turned to weeks, and the specter of war grew larger. Stannis, exasperated by the slow pace, gathered a war council. He made it clear that the Lannister threat must be confronted. Renly retorted that a wise king would find a path to avoid bloodshed if possible, earning him a stony glare from his older brother. Ned, feeling the realm slipping through his grasp, suggested that they fortify the capital and send emissaries to House Tyrell and House Martell, urging them to support the rightful king. Dornish support was always complex, but if they could gain it, the Lannisters would face an alliance of the Crownlands, Stormlands, Reach, Dorne, and the North. Some believed Tywin would not risk that, but Tywin, ever cunning, recognized that not all were fully committed to Stannis. The realm was still uncertain, and a show of force might frighten potential allies away, so Tywin marched. His army left Harrenhal and advanced along the King's Road, swelling in number as bannermen from the Westerlands joined. Rumors put the size of his host at 40,000 or more. Ned scrambled to ready the city's defenses. The gold cloaks were put under the command of a loyal captain. Men from the Stormlands and the Crownlands were called upon to defend the capital, and ravens were sent far and wide, calling upon loyal vassals to stand with the rightful King Stannis. Stannis himself, fueled by righteous conviction, stood at the gates in his black armor bearing the flaming heart of the Lord of Light, a new sigil that perplexed many and disturbed some. He had embraced the Red Priestess Melisandre, whose presence in the city was unsettling to the conservative faith of the Seven. Rumors swirled about her powers and her strange foreign god, but Stannis dismissed all doubts, certain that Lawler had chosen him to cast down the false idols and rule the realm. The uneasy alliance in the city threatened to unravel. Renly rolled his eyes at the Red Priestess's sermons about the night being dark and full of terrors. Ned Stark regarded Melisandre with cold northern suspicion, sensing a zeal in her that reminded him of fanaticism. Baelish, with his mockingbird pin, smirked whenever her name arose. Varys said nothing overt, though he made remarks about dark powers that needed to be carefully watched. Yet, for the moment, all were united by the common threat of Tywin's approaching army. And so, on a bright morning, the watchers on the city walls spotted the Lannister banners on the horizon, a sea of crimson and gold rolling across the green plains. War had come to King's Landing much earlier than it had in that other turn of events where Joffrey had sat the throne. The new defenders had the advantage of time. They had prepared, albeit not as thoroughly as they might have liked. The city was locked down, gates fortified, scorpions and catapults placed along the walls. Archers lined every vantage point. Stannis, in command of a respectable force, prepared to lead them from the walls. Ned, more concerned about preserving life than relishing battle, donned his armor. Even Renly, who would have preferred negotiation, readied himself to fight. The question remained: would Tywin truly try to take the city by storm, or was this a feint to force negotiation? For an entire day, the armies faced each other. Trumpets sounded, horns echoed, but no one launched an assault. The tension was suffocating. The next day, Tywin's envoys arrived at the city gates, demanding parley. Ned and Stannis agreed, but only under conditions that the meeting happen outside the city walls, with each side bringing a small retinue. In a broad field beneath a fluttering white banner, Tywin Lannister, flanked by loyal bannermen, met Stannis Baratheon, Lord Eddard Stark, and a handful of their knights and counselors. Tywin's cold green eyes swept across them. His armor was polished to a high shine, a golden lion roaring across his breastplate. Stannis wore black steel with the fiery heart on his chest, eyes as unyielding as flint. Ned, feeling ill at ease, still wore the direwolf crest of House Stark. They exchanged formal courtesies, each side acknowledging the possibility of bloodshed if no accord was reached. Tywin repeated his demand for the immediate release of Cersei, Joffrey, and Tommen. Stannis refused, saying justice required they be held accountable. Ned tried to mediate, offering a compromise. Joffrey and Tommen might be placed under guardianship in the Eyrie or Storm's End, while Cersei would stand trial for adultery and treason, but in a less hostile venue than King's Landing. Tywin scoffed at the notion. "You would put my grandchildren in the hands of a woman who murdered her own husband?" he sneered, referencing Lisa Arryn's rumored involvement in Jon Arryn's death, or else in the hands of Stannis' men. He made it clear that such terms were unacceptable. Stannis, losing patience, stated that if Tywin would not bend the knee to the rightful king, he would face the wrath of the throne. Tywin's mouth tightened. "I do not acknowledge any rightful king so long as my grandchildren remain your captives. Release them, and then let the lords of the realm decide who the true king should be." Stannis refused to cede an inch, convinced that by law and by the will of his red god, the throne was his. The parley ended in mutual threats. War was inevitable. Ned walked away feeling a sinking dread. He had tried to avoid this, but now the Seven Kingdoms were on the brink of open conflict. Tywin's tactics became clear within a day. Rather than launching an immediate assault on the city, where siege weaponry and walls gave the defenders the advantage, he began encircling King's Landing, cutting off supply lines and using his cavalry to harass any merchant caravans. If he could starve the city and put pressure on the defenders, he might force them to release Cersei and her children. Meanwhile, ravens flew to other great lords, seeking reinforcements or alliances. The tension within the city grew. The small folk feared a siege. Bread prices soared, black markets flourished, and rumors of secret Lannister sympathizers circulated. The Gold Cloaks tried to keep order, but King's Landing was a tinderbox. In the Red Keep, Ned and the small council wrestled with the question of how to break the siege or bring Tywin to heel. Stannis grew impatient, pushing for a sortie to shatter Tywin's lines, but Ned cautioned that Tywin's host outnumbered them. Renly advocated waiting for reinforcements from the Reach or the north. Robb Stark's banners were not yet on the move, though rumor said he was gathering an army. House Tyrell was still waiting, and the Martells of Dorne had not yet declared a side. They remembered the murder of Elia Martell and her children during the sack of King's Landing years ago, which Tywin's soldiers had perpetrated. Perhaps they would eventually side against House Lannister. Yet all of these political calculations took time, and the city's supplies were not infinite. As the siege dragged on, Joffrey stewed in captivity. The once arrogant boy, deprived of the comforts of his station, sank into fits of rage followed by sullen silences. He had no freedom to torment Sansa Stark, no crown to wear, no throne to command from. Tommen clung to childish hopes that everything would be resolved, though he missed his mother terribly. Cersei used every moment to try to manipulate her guards or any passing court official to her advantage. She threatened, she pleaded, she tried to seduce, but it availed her little. Stannis had placed men of unshakable discipline around her, a lesson he had learned from Davos Seaworth, who had once told him that the way to keep a prisoner contained was not to give them any cracks to exploit. Meanwhile, word of the war reached the Riverlands, where the lords fretted over the possibility of Tywin's army marching through their lands again. The Tullus had not forgotten the brutality of Gregor Clegane's raids. They remembered how their holdfasts had burned. A wave of sympathy for Ned Stark and for Stannis, who had exposed the Lannister deception, spread among the smaller lords. They saw in Tywin's aggression a continuation of the same violence that had tormented them before. Many smaller houses began to muster men, quietly, to support the new regime in King's Landing. Tywin's camp noted an increase in hostility along the roads leading west. Skirmishes began popping up. Gregor Clegane rode out to terrorize local villages, sending a message that Tywin would not be defied easily. The stories reached King's Landing and ignited fresh outrage. Ned Stark vowed to put an end to such atrocities. Then another event upset the board entirely. Word reached the capital that Balon Greyjoy had declared the Iron Islands independent once again, seizing the chaos as an opportunity to raid the western coasts. Tywin Lannister, forced to protect his coastline, had to detach some of his forces to deal with the ironborn threat. This development seemed like a stroke of fortune for Ned and Stannis, for it weakened Tywin's blockade. But it also complicated matters further, for the realm was fracturing into separate rebellions, reminiscent of the days after the death of King Aerys Targaryen. The War Council in King's Landing decided this was their moment to strike a blow against Tywin's lines. Stannis led a substantial force out of the city under cover of darkness, aided by Renly and a portion of the Gold Cloaks. They launched a surprise attack on one of Tywin's encampments near the Rose Road, hoping to break the siege from within. Ned, unwilling to remain idle, rode alongside them, putting aside his distaste for open battle for the sake of the realm. The midnight raid was ferocious. Archers rained arrows on Lannister tents, swords gleamed in torchlight, and chaos erupted in the camp. For a moment it seemed victory was within reach. But Tywin, a seasoned commander, had set cunning pickets, and his men rallied swiftly. The clang of steel and the screams of wounded horses filled the night. Stannis fought at the forefront, his black armor splattered with gore, his eyes shining with an almost unearthly conviction. Renly, less seasoned in war, tried to keep up with the pace, but his personal guard protected him from the thickest fighting. Ned found himself crossing swords with lesser knights wearing the Lion of Lannister. Memories of the Greyjoy Rebellion and Robert's Rebellion flooded his mind, but he pushed them aside to focus on survival. The battle turned inconclusive. Stannis managed to carve a path out of the encampment, slaying some of Tywin's best knights, but Tywin himself was not captured or killed. Stannis's forces, battered and outnumbered, had to withdraw before dawn. However, they inflicted enough damage that Tywin could no longer fully encircle the city. Stannis claimed it as a partial victory. Ned lamented the loss of life but recognized they had bought some time. The men marched back into King's Landing to a mix of relief and mourning. The small folk cheered them as heroes for daring to confront Tywin. But the cost of the conflict weighed heavily on Ned. Inside the Red Keep, the tension was palpable. Cersei's expression of cold triumph when she heard the battle was not a decisive victory revealed she still believed her father would ultimately prevail. But day by day, Tywin's siege lines weakened, especially as word spread that Robb Stark was now marching from the north with a host of loyal bannermen. The young wolf, they called him, though he was hardly more than a boy. Yet the north was rallying behind Ned Stark's cause, believing they were upholding the rightful king, Stannis. The River Lords had begun stirring as well, harassing Lannister foraging parties. If Tywin did not break King's Landing soon, he would find himself surrounded on multiple fronts. Amid all this strife, other stories spun out across the realm, seemingly disconnected but still part of the grand tapestry. Across the narrow sea, exiled Targaryens whispered of returning to claim the Iron Throne, perhaps sensing that a fractured Westeros would be ripe for conquest. On the wall, the Night's Watch grappled with reports of strange sightings in the haunted forests, though no one in the south paid much mind to those rumors. The War of the Five Kings that had begun in another timeline was morphing into something else entirely. A direct confrontation between Stannis, who demanded the obedience of the realm, and Tywin, who refused to accept the condemnation of his daughter and grandchildren. Renly, though overshadowed by his brother, remained a wild card, and the Tyrell's position was uncertain. Then came a critical turning point. A delegation from Highgarden arrived in the city, led by the redoubtable Mace Tyrell himself, along with his daughter Margaery. They brought wagons of food and supplies, a gesture that immediately won the hearts of the starving small folk. The Tyrells, after some deliberation, recognized that Stannis was the lawful heir to Robert, but also saw that Renly, not Stannis, might be more pliable as a king, and he was a man they could marry Margaery to, forging a powerful alliance. They had come to see if there was a possibility of crowning Renly instead, or at least placing him in a position of significant power. Stannis, upon receiving the Tyrells, was as curt as ever, refusing to bend on matters of kingship. He demanded their homage. Mace Tyrell, however, was not easily browbeaten. He gently broached the idea of a union between Margaery and the king. Stannis, however, was already wed to Lady Celis, so that possibility was moot. Renly was unmarried and quickly took an interest in Marjorie, though she was said to be reserved, playing her part perfectly while her father tested the political waters. Ned saw a chance to secure the city's immediate survival by cementing an alliance with House Tyrell. If the Tyrells committed their armies, Tywin's siege would be broken, King's Landing would be safe, and the war might tilt decisively in their favor. He pressed Stannis to negotiate, but Stannis was not a man easily swayed by marital alliances. "I am the rightful king," he declared. "The Tyrells should bend the knee to me without conditions, or they are traitors like the Lannisters." Mace Tyrell, affronted, threatened to withdraw his support. The small folk, dreading the return of hunger, turned worried eyes on the negotiations. Renly, seizing the moment, quietly met with Mace Tyrell and suggested a different path. If the lords of the realm did not warm to Stannis, perhaps they would accept Renly as a more amiable alternative. He did not openly speak of rebellion against his own brother, but the seeds of that idea were planted in the minds of the Tyrells. When Ned discovered these murmurings, he confronted Renly in the Tower of the Hand, demanding to know if he was plotting against Stannis. Renly denied any treachery, but he admitted that in times of war, the realm might choose a king who was more popular. Ned, troubled, reminded him of honor and law. Renly said softly, "The law gave us Joffrey. Look where that has led. The realm needs a king the lords can love, not fear." Ned felt a chill, remembering his father's fate at the hands of King Aerys. Still, he insisted that they stand by Stannis, lest the realm splinter further. Tywin's siege continued, but cracks were forming in his ring. Robb Stark was reportedly crossing the neck with a substantial force, possibly more than 20,000 men. Tywin could not hold King's Landing under siege indefinitely with the threat of the young wolf behind him. Meanwhile, the Tyrells remained in the capital, uncertain whom to back. Tension rose daily between the Tyrell retinue and Stannis's men. Each new raven brought tidings of skirmishes, alliances, betrayals. The realm was a cauldron, boiling. At last, Tywin made his move. If he could defeat Robb Stark before the northern host reached the city, he might then turn his full might back on King's Landing. His scouts reported that Robb was dividing his forces, sending some to relieve Riverrun from Jaime Lannister. Yes, Jaime had reappeared in the Riverlands with a portion of Tywin's army. The rest were presumably advancing on Harrenhal or the main Lannister positions. Tywin gambled that by splitting his army, he could fight Robb's separated forces in detail, win a decisive victory, and then return to the capital. Consequently, the main body of Tywin's host withdrew from its siege lines, heading north and west in haste. This left only a skeleton force under the command of lesser Lannister bannermen to maintain the siege. The moment the bulk of Tywin's army departed, the watchers on the walls saw the lines thinning. Renly urged an immediate attack to break the siege once and for all. Stannis agreed, though he seemed wary that it might be a trap. Ned, after some deliberation, also concurred. The plan was simple. Rally the forces within the city, sally forth, and overwhelm the diminished Lannister host. Then the road would be open to either pursue Tywin or, at least, secure the capital's supply lines. At dawn, the gates of King's Landing opened, and a combined host of Baratheon, Stark, and loyal Crownlander troops poured out, banners snapping in the breeze. The Gold Cloaks marched in formation, supplemented by knights from the Stormlands and a cavalry contingent from the Crownlands. Stannis rode at the head, grim determination etched on his face. Ned Stark and Renly Baratheon rode by his side, each with their own retinue. The Tyrell men remained within the city, not fully committed to the fight, though some Tyrell knights joined unofficially, eager for glory. The Lannister army, taken by surprise, put up a spirited defense. For a time, the field was a riot of clashing steel, bellowed war cries, and shrieks of dying men. The dust churned up by cavalry charges made it difficult to see beyond a few yards, and the roars of war horses thundered in every ear. But the defenders of King's Landing vastly outnumbered the Lannister force left behind. Bit by bit, the lion banners fell, and by noon, the siege was shattered. The roads to the south and east were open again. Stannis's men raised their banners triumphantly, and cheers erupted through the city. Ned Stark oversaw the aftermath, trying to ensure wounded foes were not butchered. Renly happily let the small folk hail him as a hero. In the Red Keep, word of the victory spread quickly. Cersei glowered in her chambers upon hearing that her father's attempt to strangle the city had been undone. She could take little solace in the fact that Tywin had gone to face Robb Stark. She still believed House Lannister would triumph eventually, but her confidence was shaken. Joffrey's mood swung from ill-tempered gloating about how his grandfather would crush the Starks to sullen silence when told about the failed siege. Now that King's Landing was free from immediate threat, Stannis demanded a coronation ceremony. He wanted to be officially crowned king of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, to show the realm that legitimacy had been established. Ned Stark hesitated. With war raging, would a grand ceremony be seen as a frivolity? Stannis insisted. The realm must see me as king, not just another warlord. With little choice, Ned complied. Preparations began, though the city was still reeling from the siege. Renly tried to convince Stannis to hold the ceremony in Storm's End, seat of their house, but Stannis refused. King's Landing was the capital, the seat of the Iron Throne. If he was the rightful king, he must be crowned where the entire realm had once bowed to Robert. The day of the coronation dawned under a pale, cloudy sky. The great September of Baelor had been readied. Stannis donned a black doublet embroidered with the fiery heart of R'hllor, a gesture that unnerved many. The crown he wore was newly forged, a band of steel set with a stag's head, reminiscent of Robert's, but lacking the flamboyant gold filigree. Melisandre stood near him, wearing red robes that set her apart from the Septons dressed in robes of pure white. The High Septon performed the ceremony reluctantly, unsettled by Melisandre's presence. The hall was filled with lords who had managed to reach the city or remained after the siege was broken. Onlookers included Ned Stark, who stood near the dais, expression carefully neutral, and Renly, who tried to appear magnanimous. Mace Tyrell lurked near the rear, his face betraying a mixture of curiosity and concern. When the crown was placed on Stannis's head, he declared himself Stannis of the House Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Undulls and the First Men, and Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. The assembled lords, or at least those who were willing, bent the knee. Ned did so out of duty, though a faint whisper of doubt nagged him. Would this new king hold the realm together or break it further apart? Renly gave a slight bow, though no vow of unwavering fealty passed his lips. The people in the Sept cheered politely, if not with the fervor they once showed Robert. Afterwards, the new king walked from the Great September to the Red Keep in a procession flanked by gold cloaks and men bearing flaming torches. The Red Priestess walked behind him, chanting praises to her god. This spectacle disturbed many devout worshippers of the Seven. Some spat on the ground or muttered about black magic. But Stannis paid no heed. In the days following his coronation, King Stannis stepped into his role with an iron will. His first order of business was to sentence Cersei for her treason, but Ned Stark implored him to show restraint, pointing out that executing her might drive Tywin into deeper war. Stannis retorted that Tywin was already at war. Justice cannot wait upon the convenience of House Lannister, he said. Still, for the sake of alliances, he allowed Ned to persuade him to hold off on the execution, at least until the end of open hostilities. Joffrey and Tommen likewise remained prisoners, though in relative comfort. Ned insisted they be treated honorably. Stannis agreed so long as they remained under lock and key. The war's momentum shifted across the realm. Robb Stark clashed with Tywin in the Riverlands, in battles that would become legendary. Sometimes the young wolf outmaneuvered the older lion, capturing supply lines and ambushing columns. Other times, Tywin's experience prevailed, forcing Robb to retreat. But one crucial difference from the original timeline was that Jaime Lannister was not free to roam at will. He was at large in the Riverlands, but he did not hold Riverrun under siege as effectively as before, given that the timeline had changed. The Tullus, uncertain but leaning pro-Stark, offered some assistance. The Tyrells in King's Landing continued to watch developments, prepared to side with whoever emerged strongest. Over time, the realm could see that Joffrey Baratheon's claim to the throne had been completely discredited, and fewer lords were willing to fight for the Lannisters without promise of immense reward. Tywin Lannister's gold and fearsome reputation still held some in thrall, but cracks were showing in his alliances. House Redwyne, House Hightower, and others in the Reach were more inclined to follow Mace Tyrell if it meant preserving stability. Dorne remained silent, but watchers on the Prince's Pass reported that Dornish troops were mustering, possibly to join the fray, possibly just to defend their borders. Thus, the war continued in fits and starts, rather than erupting into the multi-king chaos of the original War of the Five Kings. Instead of Joffrey wearing the crown in the Red Keep, Stannis reigned, his hold on power tenuous but real. Renly watched for any opportunity to become the realm's preferred Baratheon if Stannis proved too harsh or alienating. Ned Stark served dutifully on the small council, trying to steer the king toward moderation but often meeting with frustration. The Lannisters were battered from multiple directions, though not yet defeated. Cersei remained imprisoned, her spirit unbroken, plotting any chance to escape or see her father triumph. Joffrey sulked, Tommen wept, Myrcella languished under the watch of the faith. In this turning of the wheel, the boy King Joffrey never sat the Iron Throne, never played out his cruelties in the Red Keep's halls, never ordered Ned Stark's execution in a fit of spite. The realm avoided that immediate tragedy, but it did not avoid bloodshed altogether. War still swept through the land, albeit in a different form. The question of legitimacy remained, but in this version of events, the blatant truth of Joffrey's parentage had been laid bare before he could claim the crown. This revelation, intended to save the realm, plunged it into a different conflict. One led not by a vicious boy king but by a stern, unyielding man convinced that law and a new god favored him above all others. Whether that was truly an improvement, few could say. Yet hope lingered. With Ned Stark alive and active in King's Landing, there was at least a voice of measured reason close to the king's ear. Perhaps Stannis, guided by Ned's counsel, might avoid some of the worst excesses. Perhaps the presence of Renly and the possibility of forging alliances through marriage would encourage a negotiated settlement. Perhaps the Tyrell's caution would steer the realm toward a swift resolution if they decided to side wholeheartedly with Stannis. And perhaps Tywin Lannister, confronted by multiple threats, might eventually see that the war was unwinnable, leading him to negotiate the release of Cersei and her children in exchange for peace. Or perhaps not, for the flames of war, once lit, rarely die easily. Future battles would test Stannis' resolve, Robb Stark's determination, Tywin's cunning, and every lord's capacity for loyalty or betrayal. The small folk, as ever, would pay the highest price, their fields trampled and their homes sacked by soldiers fighting for kings they never chose. Each rumor that spread through the countryside, of an oncoming winter, of ironborn raids, of Targaryens across the sea, fanned the embers of fear. And in the end, no matter how events unfolded, the greatest truth remained. So long as ambition and secrets ruled the hearts of men, the Iron Throne would be as dangerous as it was glorious. Yet one thing was certain: the savage tyranny of King Joffrey Baratheon, that dark chapter which so many had feared, would not come to pass in this turning of fate. His golden crown would remain unworn. The blood he might have spilled would remain unspilled. The horrors unleashed by his unchallenged ascension would never take shape. Instead, the Seven Kingdoms found themselves following a new thread in the tapestry of destiny. A thread that bound them all to a stern king who believed himself the champion of law and fire, an arrested queen who refused to be broken, and a hand of the king who strove with every breath to keep the realm from tearing itself apart. Whether the name of Stannis Baratheon would ring down through history as a just ruler or a tyrant of a different stripe, whether the Lion of Lannister would rise again to savage its foes, or whether the wolves of the north might carve out their own kingdom, these were questions yet to be answered. But as the ravens flew, the armies marched, and the lords schemed, the world remembered the day Joffrey Baratheon did not become king, and how it changed everything under the sun.